Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for stopping by, coming to the talk. Thanks to Activision Digital Dragons for hosting in this beautiful city and this incredible event. I'm pretty overwhelmed by this experience, to be honest. Obviously, I'm Aaron Limonick. I'm the concept art director at Activision and now Elsewhere Entertainment. So hey, there's some big news, right? Activision starting a new studio, new IP. And I felt that it would be wrong if I didn't mention a few things first. So today, this year marks my 20th year working in games, working in the entertainment industry, which is a big milestone for me, obviously. And I've been very fortunate to work on some super fun projects, obviously, over the years. But nothing that I've done can even come close to what we're doing right now, which is, for me, if you would have told in 2004, this kid that one day would be starting a new studio with one of the biggest publishers in the world and building a new IP and being in the very early stages of that, I would definitely not have believed you. So I just wanted to say a couple shout-outs. First of all, shout out to my team at Elsewhere Entertainment. Just absolutely stellar individuals. You all know who you are. Thanks to Steve and Mihao. None of these things happen without leadership being behind it and without people believing in you. Everybody needs somebody to say, all right, let's see what you can do. Everybody needs that, and that's really the genesis of what this is here. So I just want to say shout out to my team and all those individuals. Thank you, I appreciate it. So without any further ado, we could get started. Talking about world building, I think this general idea for this talk really has a lot to do with this long span of a design process that I have amassed, and being from a certain era of when I came out of school. I think that would probably be, if I were to give you a brief introduction, because we don't have tons of time, I think that the most important thing for me to talk about would have to do with that time when I came out of school. So if I may date myself, those of us who were the older millennials, we were sort of the last of a generation. So take you on a little journey. People that were coming out of school in 2004, 2005, there was a very difficult choice that we had to make. And that is that there was not any of this. There was no concept of how, to become a concept artist, a concept designer. So we were the last generation of people who became concept artists without any idea of what we were doing. You had to either choose illustration, or you had to choose industrial design, right? And as it turns out, our discipline of being concept designers is a hybridization of those two things. So if you went to school after us, you would have gotten some curriculum of this idea of concept design. But when we were in school, we were very aware of this fact that if you chose one path, you're inherently weak in the other. That's just the way the school was and education was back then. So obviously, illustration is a discipline of making pretty pictures, right? We're familiar with that. Industrial design is about making functional design for a use, for some reason. And it may not be as focused on making a pretty picture, but you're focused on ergonomics, aerodynamics, human factors, and things like that are really comprehensive. And illustration is focused on gesture and feel and art, and all the artsy stuff. We know what that is. And so ultimately, we were sort of sculpting this new era of hybridizing these two disciplines and borrowing from each other, learning from each other. And what that got us was a very deep connection to the roots of that discipline, either one of us, And I think there's something to that. So if you want to make fun of my hair, this would be a great time to do it, because that guy right there has a terrible haircut. So little do people know, if you're at all familiar with my career, my work, while I was studying concept art, what we thought was concept art, I did not make it into the entertainment industry because of some connection with entertainment or anything. Has nothing to do with the school I went to or anything like that. It actually has to do with the fact that my very deep connection to a very misunderstood subculture, graffiti art. I live in Los Angeles and spent about 10 years very immersed in hip-hop, graffiti, that entire scene. And it just so happens that an artist working at Treyarch, who was a texture artist on Spider-Man, was a fellow graffiti artist and referred me at the right place and the right time to the artists at Neversoft. And there I am wearing my eyeball. Neversoft, may she rest in peace. She was absorbed into Infinity Ward. But that's the beginning of my career. And I always look at this, and I just think this is so funny. Because of all that hard work, I worked so hard. I worked like there was no tomorrow when I was in school. And it's a funny turn of events that has nothing to do with how I got into the industry. So Neversoft, I went into work on Tony Hawk, and that was obviously, we were making the 8th Tony Hawk game at the time, which was very urban, very street, like we wanted to incorporate graffiti and texture and stylization into what we were doing. So that's a little bit of that backstory. I think that is kind of funny, actually, to be honest. So yeah, I'd like to start by giving a little bit of, for people that, might wonder, where do people's inspirations come from? I'm very I dissect what I'm doing all the time, and I think back on the past a lot. So if I were to, have to break down my own interests and my own work into categories, you can almost see what I'm indexing at different times in my career, my life, the stuff that I'm looking at the most. And so if I were to go starting from the left, the classic illustration stuff that everybody studies in school, the romanticized painters of the 19th century, you've got Albert Bierstadt, you've got Clyde Aspig, you've got Granville Redmond, you've got illustrators like Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth, so much. There's a million names, but that is what I studied in school. Right? And then going into what's also funny is that I thought, when I was in school, I really thought I was going to probably work in the animation industry because I was, you can see it a little bit, stylization, graffiti, things of that nature. And I thought that I would work in animation. And all the while in school, I was building the perfect skill set to work in games, and I just didn't know it yet. That's just part of that funny connection of my generation to these weird ways that we started our job. So you see, you got Miyazaki stuff, you got Disney stuff in there, just the classics, Magnetic Rose, the stuff that we grew up with. There's something to that always, resonates with me, and I definitely, a lot of my work has that in it. You can tell. And then lastly, I think it would be a fail to not mention vintage sci-fi. Maybe not so much modern sci-fi, but I feel that vintage sci-fi has a presence in my work, and if you just based on these categories, if you were to go through, you'd be like, oh yeah, I see that. That's exactly what you're referencing, and I'll call some of this out as we go through it a bit. So another very important part about my inspiration is travel and being experienced to cultures. I was telling someone yesterday, I really wish that I had been forced to travel more when I was younger. Obviously, you don't have money when you're in college, so we all have that thing. But when you start seeing things in reality, in real life, you start understanding the way things were made, and you start understanding why photos can never be enough to understand the DNA of what a place is. And as I've been a character artist and a character designer and creatures and weapons and all that, but at my core, I'm an environment designer. I'm a world builder type of person. So to me, going to any place, like a beautiful city like this, I'm going to be drawing stuff like what I'm seeing for 6 months from now. It's just ingrained in my brain. So, getting into some of the specifics of that, the personality of various different cities, the way that they may make you feel when you get there. It's hard to encompass that in your art, but that is what we're trying to do, is make someone feel something that you felt when you were witnessing that in the place. The town of, the city of Bath versus the city of Barcelona, they make you feel very different, and you can see the ancient influences that are involved in that. Obviously, detail and architecture, it's a huge thing. These are just from my sketchbook that I recently, over the last several years, picked up again. I sort of lost touch with my sketching, and it really, I feel like it's a really good way to connect with those things in a simplistic way and understand the appreciation that those people took to communicate those things in their designs. And then obviously the obvious one, grandeur and scale, you just can't represent that in a photo or even in a painting. Being there and seeing it for real is really what influences my art more than anything. So again, we're talking about world building. A lot of this art that I'm showing here, they're just examples that are sort of relevant in that topic. But again, you can kind of see where these ideas come from and what you're relying on as your reference when you look into some of the images. And I think again, to just recap, world building to me is the the effort of putting all of that simplistic design language, that really foundational design language, into something that can take a very complex problem, breaking it down by simple ingredients. And we're going to go into that a little bit later as well. So one of the core, I'm going to go through some of the pillars of what I think in what makes a world believable. How do you make something feel like how you felt when you were there, or create something new that has a feeling, which is even harder? So design literally equals intention. It means your intention. What is your intention? If you don't know, how were we going to know? So to me, the way that you approach that, or the way that you technically achieve that, has nothing to do with the design. I think that the technique should follow the design, not the other way around. We can certainly have a long debate that we don't have time for here of how other examples where that's not true. I will surrender that. But in general, I think the design, your intention, should come first before anything else. So I'll read a couple of these. The goal of world building can be described as crafting a complex subject matter by reorganizing simple ingredients. So just to touch on that, what does that sound like? That sounds like sports. That sounds like boxing has 4 punches, that's all they have. And yet humans can do unbelievable things. Music, you can play Mozart on a child's little xylophone. Don't ask me how I know that, but you actually, it's a few notes, and that's all you have, and yet you can make things that last the test of hundreds of years by doing that. That is interesting to me. That is something that I'm always digging deep on. Why is it, and we all know this, when you see someone who's really good at the people who we look up to as artists or musicians or whatever, why is it that I can understand what they're doing, but why can't I do that? It's very like beyond normal human comprehension of how do you take such simple ingredients and make so many varieties, millions of varieties of amazing, amazing solutions of those things. So here's 3 examples of 3 sci-fi environments, and I think going through those, you can kind of see maybe IPs that I might be influenced by, or other materials that I might be influenced by. You can see one that's relying heavily on an otherworldly essence to make it cool, right? It's giant planetoid things and ships, hundreds of ships floating, and endless galaxies, things like that. And then you've got something that involves scale, so something that is generally kind of grounded, right? You could almost exist on our planet, but it's got really big scale. There's nothing crazy sci-fi happening other than a big crashed satellite thing. So there's one aspect of it that's interesting. And then you have a very grounded, very Akira-like, but in the real world sort of index image. Now, all 3 of them could maybe, I guess you could argue, could exist in the same universe, but they all rely on a very different mechanism that makes them interesting. So, again, the title of the page, believability, to me, what makes something feel like a real space, that's what we're really trying to do. Like, when you're a student, you make crazy designs that don't necessarily have a believability to them. Anyone can make crazy shapes, but what is it that makes a place feel like somewhere that you've actually been? And that's where you can take the viewer or the player on a journey into another world and make them really resonate with those designs. To me, that's the real secret recipe of that. And again, there is no real complex answer. It's a matter of those things previously mentioned, of making a connection to a culture, to a time period, to something that we resonate with, and we all know it when we see it. A design where maybe you haven't seen it before, but you feel like you have seen it before. I don't know how a better way to explain that, but to me, when I see Space Odyssey 2001, when I see the Nostromo, or like you could show someone that today, and they would think it's just as cool as they did back then. And I think there's something in that. I studied this stuff a lot, and I don't have the right answer, but there is a DNA in that I think comes from that idea. So another really useful process that I like to use. This is an exercise, right? If you're trying to establish what you want to do, right? If you don't know what you want to do, we're not going to know what you want to do. So in the effort of like, well, I like all this stuff. You have a big page of stuff, whatever that is. Try to think of it as if it was a gradient from white to black or from whatever, where would these pieces sit on that gradient scale? And I think it's a useful exercise because it forces you to use critical thinking to edit out things and to try to place them where you think they are in relation to each other. And as a mental exercise, that is super useful for figuring out what you want to do. Do I want to do hardcore sci-fi, like military-looking, type of cities, hyper-industrial, super clean, minimal color? Do I want to do something that feels kind of fantasy-like? And it's, I could see a blend in between those worlds, but the stuff on the right is extremely fantasy, and it has elements of some type of an urban feeling to it. Like there's a civilization, but it's not anything to do with what's on the left. And then you can see the middle category where I can almost see a transition. I can almost see a world that incorporates both of those somewhere in the middle. Very different. It takes way longer to do than originally I thought when I was making the slide. Why does that take so long? Well, it's a very comprehensive process of editing out things that don't fit and finding similarities, and even color palette. You could even do it with color palette, make it even more difficult. But it is, again, creating a believable world, an immersive world that makes us feel like we are there or we could be there. I think that's like cutting it to its core. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of icons and making something memorable, right? We've all been, or seen it, you don't need to go there, but seeing some of these real icons and real objects, real structures, megalithic, giant structures that were built, thousands of years ago in some cases, there's certain aspects of them, shape language-wise, that make you feel a certain way or that make something memorable. And I think however you go about that, there's so many, there could be a whole class on just that, how to make something iconic, believable, memorable. I think there's some aspect of that we do on a regular basis, maybe without realizing it. But I think shape language, recognition, and again, that consistency is at the core of every amazing movie, every amazing game. And it could be very subtle, and it could be very, very heavy-handed. I'm going to show you some examples of both. But I think that we can learn a lot from the real icons that exist all around us in the world. So here's a couple so here's the deal. I think if not everyone in this room can at least recognize one of those, if not all three of those, and know exactly what they are, even though it's very graphic and very, very simplified. I think if you can make something iconic, you maybe see where I'm going with this, but making something iconic and memorable is at the absolute first stages. It's a person sitting with another person in a coffee shop, and a napkin and a Sharpie marker can make the design that is going to make something memorable. Everything that happens after that is the fun part, and it's cool, but that's not what makes something memorable like these icons right here. Those things are, and the more you look into it, this is just three, this is just the Empire. You could go into what they did with the rebels. You could look at what they did with the Sand People. You can look at every aspect of this particular franchise, and you can do the same thing. You can see where those aspects were made consistent and were made really, really simplified. And then there's a whole other talk about the details and the language of the set building and the model building and all that amazing stuff. But the litmus test for that is, and this isn't, I thought this was a fun slide. I don't think it's necessarily 100% true all the time. But I think that if a child can draw your design, and they've seen it, they remembered it, and they can draw it in that simplistic way, I think you might be on the right track in terms of something that is memorable and broken down into simple, large, medium, and small, right? That's a very common design idea, whether you're in school or whether you're working on a job. Large, medium, small. As humans, we recognize things in threes. We recognize large, medium, small in all cases. And the more you think of things in those terms, the more digestible, the more it's just easier to make a design memorable. So just one little thing I wanted to add that I thought of after making the slide is that we spend our whole life learning how to see things the wrong way. Children see things as a tree is a popsicle stick and a little lollipop at the top. They see a cloud as a little curly puff. They're seeing things in icons, and you spend your entire life learning how to see what you think something looks like, not what the visual icon of what it is. And you learn this as soon as you go to art school. People start learning figure drawing or whatever it is, and they're looking at it in a way, and it happens to everyone. You're looking at it in the wrong way, and in art school, it's the beginning of a process where you learn how to see the right way again. It's nothing to do with your hand. It has to do with the way your eye is seeing these shapes. So talking about shape, large, medium, small, you can see here, this is, again, a whole topic. This is very condensed, but the idea of shape in general, you can create shape with texture. You can, in the first image. The second image, you can create shape with lighting. That's a way to create a shape that has a particular feel to it. And you can create shape with volume. Those are all three completely different approaches of how we interpret that. And I think in creating a world, creating something, an environment, a world, whatever you want to say, could even be done with characters. But I think that the idea of using shape as a mechanism is again, these are all, I'm trying to take you on a journey of all the biggest pillars of how those things are approached in my mind. So a very grounded one that everyone is probably familiar with. I'm not saying I'm necessarily the biggest fan, but I think this is one of the most obvious examples of something that we can see. So Lamborghini has been very, very open and heavy-handed with the obsession with hexagonal shape language, even down to every little button. I just did a little shape breakdown on the left, which I think actually is fairly representative of that. But even looking in the blurry photo of the air conditioning duct in the background, that's a straight-up hexagon. It's in the spokes and the wheels. It's in the radiator intakes. It's in everything, the exhaust pipes. They really went to crazy lengths, and even when it can't be a hexagon, it's some type of one-off adjacent shape that's like a hexagon. So this is just an obvious example. There's so many of the ones that are a little bit more subtle, but I think that when you creating a brand, creating something that can be memorable, I think this mechanism is very strong. And obviously there's many reasons why the hexagon's interesting, but I think it could be done in a lot of different ways. And again, as a gradient, this was another great exercise to look at that as a gradient. How heavy-handed do we want to be with that? Does that fit the idea of the IP? And so on and so forth. Cool. So then there's another side of it, of how they make you feel. So this is, some of you might recognize, I'm trying to do a very shape painterly breakdown so it doesn't look just like an actual shot from the film, but the very first shot of A New Hope, the first Star Wars movie, you see this tiny little rebel ship being chased by this behemoth of a Star Destroyer on top. And I don't know about you, but the way it makes me feel is like I'm going to be crushed between this huge, gigantic planet underneath and this Star Destroyer with a point on top. Psychologically, I was very fortunate to have an instructor in college who did the storyboards for this actual scene. And they were talking about how that in so many different ways, this is one of the amazing mechanisms of film, is that it's a controlled shot. In games, this is a lot harder to do because it's not a controlled shot, it's interactive, so it's a totally different process. But the psychology of how you can make someone feel with shapes, again, this is the example of using volumes and using also value, right? The blackness of space, the endless void, and these massive, gigantic forms that are flying through space. It's everything. You could look at this composition in another way and get a completely different feeling. So this is, if you turn upside down, it's more or less the same composition. If I give you cutout sheets of paper and I had you arrange them together to create a composition, you would have essentially the same shapes here. And yet, in this case, it is a feeling of it's a pilgrimage, it's a discovery, it's magical, it's majesty, it's something precious. You could describe it in a lot of different ways. But this idea of placing that small little shape, in this case it's a little bit more of a spire, representing the rebel ship in the earlier image, it's the opposite impact. It's something that feels uplifting and cool and exploratory. I thought that was interesting myself. Another example, and this is a little more game designy, but the example of how you can communicate to the player in this case what a space means in terms of what we're not seeing, the space that we're enclosed in, like this room, the shapes that we're seeing in the room and those volumes penetrating through the walls, through the floor, and in other environments, or the shape of the room, and what that tells you about the rest of the space that you can't see. So in this case, you have a kind of a generic sort of cross-section cutaway of a giant hull of a dropship, some type of large ship. And these cylinders going through the floor represent some type of strut brace or some conduit where electrical pipes are going through it or something, whatever. But you get this interesting negative shapes in between, and the shapes of those corridors in the consecutive floors going down would be completely different, And maybe you would, in a game, maybe you would learn more about this gigantic structure that you're in the further you go down to the basement or something like that. Just another way to communicate using shape, using volume, something that makes the player feel a certain way. I'm seeing this curvature in the ceiling. That's the hull of the ship, right? You see this in submarines all the time, super crazy. So another really important thing that I think I wanted to touch on, scale is a super strong aspect of world building in the sense of, obviously we know if we're doing a real world, if we're making this room, you have scale that you recognize. You have a microphone, you have an exit sign, you have doors and handles. You see those things and you immediately connect with the space. As humans, this is what we do. But the crazier you go away from that, the more inventive you go, the more you need to inject that back into it in some symbolic way. Otherwise, we get lost. I learned this on when I worked at High Moon on War for Cybertron. You're making a world that exists on an alien planet with giant robots that are all 30 feet tall. So if everyone's 30 feet tall, there is no human scale. There's only Optimus Prime scale. It's like a mental, explosion. Everything changes. If you have those two together, now you have a disconnect, right? So you want to make something that feels unique and realistic in terms of something that we resonate with. Well, you need things like mailboxes. You need things like windows and storefronts and lamps and things of that nature. So, in essence, you need to inject those more grounded elements back into it. Again, talking about the details of shapes, what shapes actually mean. If you're looking at a cylindrical shape, you are containing liquid and gas. If you're looking at something more blocky and more like a cube, that's usually conduit. That's some type of electrical box. Thin rectangular shapes, that's trim, that's structural supports. You're looking at something that's a compound shape, that is often some type of mechanism. In this case, that's like a turbocharger, like an air compressor. So again, these are things you recognize in these sketches, but if you start making something sci-fi and something really crazy, these underlying elements connect and make a world feel believable in their essence. And the same thing that they did here on the Sandcrawler. They're kit bashing together elements of tanks and model kits onto some very bizarre, larger shape, which makes that thing feel somehow connected to reality. So the negative space editing things out, taking things out, is actually really important as well. What you leave out is more important than what you put in a lot of cases. So we can definitely explore that a little bit. And just in this cropped image, you can see there's like hundreds of objects in there. But when you squint your eyes, there's a very squintable read. And I think even in an image or an entire world, there's a conversation to be had about how to achieve that. So again, the title of the slide, it should be getting better, not just different. So if you're just adding stuff in and it's not making the situation, the game, the level, whatever, better, then you're just making it different. You're just changing it. And then you have to evaluate, do I need to take something out? Would it be better if I took something out? And a lot of times the answer is yeah. Managing areas of great complexity, that doesn't work without areas of simplicity to rest, right? If you're creating a large world, if you're creating something, a large city, fantasy, sci-fi, whatever it happens to be, you have to be very conscious of, I'm overloading the eye with something, which is okay. You should walk right into that. But that means that you have to balance that with the opposite, right? So that idea of balancing complexity with simplicity is the art of editing, and it is the hardest thing to do as an artist. You hyper-focus, and then you forget about the macro. So it's all about keeping sight of the macro while working on details. So the classic, who, what, why, when, and how. This is, I'll just briefly talk about it as you can read the text if you'd like, but basically it just means, again, these are all mechanisms, ways that we connect with a story, with a visual. Whether there's a narrative involved or it's just a cool visual, if you don't know the answer to those questions at all and you didn't think about it at all, there's going to be there's a likelihood that I won't understand that either. So, I meaning the viewer. So it's not that hard to just make a checklist, a brainstorm, and maybe you only answer 3 of those questions. Maybe you only answer 2. But what you're trying to do should be at the forefront, and everything that you do looking at the previous slides, shape language, lighting, mood, all that should support that initial idea. So this is an image that I created. I haven't shared this before. It's just something I'm sharing for this. But I wanted to just kind of go through a little bit of the process of just making an image and me actually doing those things that I just mentioned and how I work like that. So I start by, this is my whole thing, this idea of me being connected to the idea of this foundation skills. Everything is about how can I arrive at the solution using those simple ways of determining what I actually want to do. So to me, this is, digital painting or just sketching is, to me, that. And if I could do it with even less, like I mentioned before, on a napkin and with a marker on a napkin, even better. If I'm arriving at something like, I actually like the way those shapes work together, even better. Because everything you do after that, you start your modeling and your lighting and rendering, everything you do after that is going to support that early thing that made you like it. You could draw a TIE fighter on a napkin very easily, as we see. I just wanted to share a page that I threw out that I was like, that's a cool, Tudor kind of style, cottagey English houses and some just quick ideas, but I figured it would be worth it to share just so you could see. That was something I tried. Let's see some shapes, let's see a composition, and then I went with the other previous idea. So this is just my thought process of like, what is it that we're doing? Is it a deep canyon down in the core of some planet? Right, I have some shape language that I'm looking at, Otomo pretty heavily for. I think some of you may recognize, and these kind of giant tankers. Again, looking back at the slide about what shapes mean, you can tell these are like some type of gas tanks, fuel tanks, some volumes that are gaseous or liquid, because that's what that means. Whether you know that or not doesn't even matter. You know it psychologically as a human being in the world. You know what that means. So this is an example of that, and arriving at that super early is actually really important, I think. So this is another idea that I use quite a lot, is that I kind of look at, when I'm working, I like to work macro to micro. This is, again, that thing I was just talking about, which is if you solve those big problems first, and doing it in the most simplistic way and answer those really tough questions for yourself with reference, with your sketching, with your whatever it is, everything else gets boiled down into a way simpler problem to solve. I think you run into more problems if you go in and you try to do this entire world-building process as a one thing, and you're flying around in 3D, you're trying to light, you're trying to figure out textures, you're trying to figure out composition, let's find the right angle, let's do the... Now again, there are people I know who literally do that, and they're phenomenal artists, but I think that you will have an easier time if you break down the macro first and hone in tighter and tighter. So when you get in there and you're staring close at something, you're not even thinking about the big picture anymore, because you already answered those questions. You know exactly what you want to do. You know exactly what the shapes mean. So you're going in and looking at the model, you're modeling, sculpting, whatever you're doing. You've already decided what the shapes mean. So you're involved in the technical part. I mentioned this earlier in the talk. You're involved in the technical part after you already solved the what, right? The design, your intention. I mentioned that before. And then once you solve that, then now you're working on lighting. How do I achieve those, thinking back to the Star Destroyer image, how do I achieve what I had in that sketch, the feeling that makes me feel? How do I achieve that with lighting? Well, cool, you're not worrying about the model anymore. You're worrying about how do I achieve that feeling? So that's a lighter, right? You're a lighter now. And then you get back down to the end, and now you're a texture artist. You're painting textures, or you're adjusting things down to the final VFX, the glow and the bloom and the smoke and whatever. Now you're a VFX artist. I look at it like breaking it down like a production pipeline almost. Again, we've all had to make finished products in like a day, and you're stressed out, you're doing it all at once. That's not the ideal. It's not the best case scenario. You can do it. I'm saying this is the best case scenario if you want to control the outcome and how the viewer will feel about what you're creating. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about a few of the important points of questions that, the most common questions I get asked. I know we're sort of running out of time, but the most common question that I get asked is, how do you still find energy to do this? Like as 20 years goes by, my younger colleagues, some of my friends that have been started working much more recently, you start getting burnout, you start getting this feeling of like, how do you find inspiration? How are you still doing this? Like, I'm not tired. I could still be an artist every day. I've decided to be in a more directing role, but I could be an artist every day and be very happy and be inspired. So what is that? Why do you have the energy to still do that? So I figured it would be cool to talk about that a little bit. As I showed some slides earlier about the graffiti and some of my early beginnings and the development of the concept design as an educational platform system. And to me, it is actually that connection to the more foundational, earlier part of my life. And I think to me, that is at the core of what sparks that childlike interest in yourself of what makes you want to do these things. Like we get very bogged down by work, by production, by this very regimented process, right? But that's different. Being an artist and being inspired versus being a good production artist are not separated. They're not connected, in my opinion. I think it's our own personal interest to fuel that fire and that sense of wonder in ourselves of wanting to stay connected to that, why we started doing it in the first place. Now, I'm not suggesting you should run across the freeway with spray cans at 3 in the morning, just to be super clear in case someone's thinking that I'm recommending that. Definitely bad ideas. But what I'm saying is, everyone has that thing, right? The reason why you got into it in the first place. And for me, I very much lost touch over a certain point with my connection to sketching, drawing. Why did you start doing art? Why did you think you want to be an artist in the first place? And when I really found a new stride, a new level of energy, was that going back to that earlier part of my life where that was why I started doing it in the first place. I love production. I always will. That's a whole other side of it. But I think that for our mental health as artists and designers, connecting to that childlike sense of why you started doing it in the first place is everything. That's the whole story. That's the answer to that question. So yeah, I just want to leave you with that. I think we have some time for Q&A, I believe. But yeah, I want to leave you with that. Thank you all so much. This is surreal. This is insane. Thank you so much.
Cool. If you want to ask a question, you have to be put on the spot. Yeah, I would like to ask a question as someone who's not really an artist, but you've said a lot about shapes and these contrasting shapes between something that's more oblong and something that's more aggressive.
Yeah.
Do you have any either tips or tricks or just general ideas about taking contrasting shapes, like in one of the arts you showed at the very end with the escalator, where the main path has very aggressive shapes and draws the viewer's attention, and the background has some aggressive shapes, but some more oblong shapes. Do you have any tips and tricks on how would you use contrasting shapes to either guide attention or do anything else you want to do with the feeling of the image?
Yeah, good question. I mean, if you're talking about contrasting like complexity with more simple stuff, I think like value in lighting is usually the best way to unify things together. I always like to solve it in the larger scheme of things before just like saying everything's super detailed and I'm just going to solve it with lighting. I'd rather think of an environment like if you're creating a level, right? The hard thing about games is obviously I can do this and I can do this, so there is no shot. Right? You're cheating it. But the idea is if you had that feeling of that shot everywhere, like the idea of the walls are fairly complex, but as they go up, they get larger and more spread apart, right? Like as a texture, as an abstract. Of course, the part down at the bottom, you can go really nuts with the pipes and the details, but if you find places where like those huge tankers, those are actually, that's the function of that's the rest, right? That's the area where you can be really aggressive in some places and load it up, and then you can find areas where the rest, and I don't think there is I wish there was a recipe of how to figure it out, but you know it when you see it. Does that feel overwhelming, or does it feel like it works? Is it because of the lighting? Is it because the textures are kind of even? I don't know. Every piece is a completely different process. And I'm always jealous of people that work like an assembly line. They're like, A, B, C, D, done. I'm like very ADD all over the place. Like I balance it as I go because that's just, I think each one is a different problem to solve. And I don't have a real answer to that. Maybe, hopefully I answered your question, but
Yeah, thank you very much.
absolutely, yeah, for sure.
Do you have any opinion on building completely alien worlds that have little to no in common with human culture? What do you think about this? Because like now we do have a couple of science fiction and fantasy aesthetics that dominate world building, and that you can see them in most of the audiovisual media of the kind. But I feel that there is a need to incorporate some new elements to those aesthetics or create something different altogether. And I already see that people are already pondering the differences, like artificial forms of life. For example, in the Invincible, I don't know if you are familiar with that game. I mean, it's an adaptation of a book based on Stanislav Lem, a Polish author, where there is a very interesting life form, which is, it's difficult to explain in English. You would have to see it for yourself, but what do you think about creating this? Like, I remember that you said that something has to be at least partly connected to the human culture in terms of symbolism, so that we have connection to the space.
Yeah.
But I think that in some concepts, in some aesthetics, it's already becoming a bit worn out, and there needs to be new elements.
So yeah, I think there's a lot there, obviously, to break down, but yes, some of those ideas are a bit worn out, but when I think just as a general rule, right, there's always, rules are made to be broken, and you could prove me wrong, probably, with some designs that don't need that connection. But I think, this is just from my personal experience, and I would be super open to people showing examples or me finding examples where it wasn't necessary. I just think as humans, if the talk is about making a world iconic and believable, then I think, if that's the discussion, then I think as humans, if you want to make us connect with it, your goal may not be to make us connect with it. Your goal may be to make us feel like we're lost, right? If you want to make someone feel lost and like the inside of Prometheus or something like that. Like, there's not much in there that is like, oh, there's a door handle, oh, there's a fire alarm, there's a trash can. Like, they don't have that in there, right? And you're meant to feel like, I don't even know how to do I stick my hand into the thing and then that makes the door open? I don't even know. Like, there's that as a mechanism too. So what I was talking about is more like that the image that I was showing in that shot is like everything is completely made up. There's nothing there's nothing that's like you could find an example of it somewhere. It's all completely original. You can do that as many different ways as you'd like if you connect something that like you said it actually pretty well, symbolically connect something that we understand. I'm not familiar with the reference that you gave, so I don't know what that would look like, but I would be super interested to see it being done another way, to be honest.
I might have a little bit triggering question, but I really would like to know your opinion about this. I would like to ask you, what do you think about using AI tools in conceptualization of words, like pre-conceptualization, knowing that it's not going to be a final result, but just a help for visualizing the words?
I mean, I don't have too official of a position on that. I think that my personal experience is like every 5, 6, 7, 8 years, whatever it is, whatever timeline you want to put on it, there's like a rebirth or a new tool that shakes us all up, right? And it's funny because I've gone through having been around for this long, I've gone through this like 4 times already, where it's like, just to answer your questions, I didn't mention this in the talk, but this is actually relevant, of like, I went to school learning how to paint in acrylic and gouache and oil and sketching, and that's all I did. There was no like, here, oh, you need to learn Blender now, or you need to photo bash now. They didn't know anything about this. Like, literally in the 5 years that I was in an entire art school, From the beginning to the end, everything was totally different. You get out of school, you're like, cool, all that stuff you just did, so we're not doing that anymore. We're going to do photo bashing now. That's the thing. And you got Craig Mullins doing amazing work that he's doing, and it's like bringing John Singer Sargent and putting photos together. Like, that's awesome. But that was like, all right, you're on your head, now you have to readjust, right? And the same thing happened again, where it's like, yeah, cool, you're photo bashing, you get that down, but now everyone's using 3D. You're like, but I spent so long learning how to draw this stuff in perspective. Too bad. It's just is what it is. Now, I'm not saying that AI is equivalent, because it's a completely different level of like, there's so many legal things, and there's a great talk here about that. I don't have a position on that. But what I do know is that my thought process is it going away or is it going to stay? You can answer that for yourself, and I'll answer that for myself. If you think it's going to stay, then figure out a way to adapt to that in your own way. That's what I've done every step of the way. I don't love some of the things that have happened over the last 20 years and various different aspects of the industry and whatever, but we just learn to adapt however we can, or you choose a different a path that suits you better. I wish, it's a tough question, obviously. I knew someone would ask that. I don't really have a good answer, to be honest. How do I feel about it? Probably the same as you do, to be honest. Probably the same as everybody, but here we are. We're going to figure it out. Of course. Anyone else? No? Okay. Thank you so much.